Alright, hello and welcome to the melee weapon review. Warframes are all done, so it's time to get started with this. This is going to be a little bit different than we've done in the past, because I've kind of categorized some things in a new way. So basically, for weapons, there's going to be my top 5, which will be a numbered top 5 as we get to them, and that's like the strongest 5 weapons in the game. And then there's going to be best in class, so if a weapon is the best of, say, the polearm category, it will be the best in class of those weapons. That is overridden by it being in the top 5, because then obviously it's best in class for that kind of weapon, just by merit of that. So there's that, and then there is MR fodder, and then there's kind of your general weapons between best in class and MR fodder, which is just like weapons that are worth using, or there's a specific reason to use them, stuff like that. So MR fodder weapons, I'm not really going to go into because they're just trash weapons that are just there for MR. So, with that, let's get started. Alright, so starting out strong with the Akenbrune. These are the best in class for the sword and shield weapons, and while sword and shield may not have many weapons in it, the Akenbrune are good weapons, and also on the merit of Final Harbinger being a very good, very fun stance, this weapon is worth using. It's got a decent augment that is kind of interesting. It's very situationally useful. It does decent damage. It's got things going for it. It's best in class, and since there's not much in this class, that mostly just means that this weapon is great, not amazing, but being a great weapon is pretty good. Moving on, we've got our first MR fodder weapon. So the Amphis doesn't really have any redeeming qualities early on in the game, and in just in general, is not really worth your resources to build unless you're just looking to level it. The Anku, on the other hand, is very good early, can be built very, very early at MR3, and since the Scythe buff, this weapon actually turns out to be pretty good. During those mid-game areas where the enemies that you're generally going to be having trouble with is your damage output on Grineer-type enemies that are heavily armored, this, with its high puncture damage, good crit rate, all that stuff, good attack speed, it's got a lot of things going for it, and it will do a really good amount of damage early on. So, early on, good pick. Alright, then we've got the Ankros series. So, these weapons are too short range, don't do enough damage, and really have no significant, good merit to them. They're super MR fodder. They just don't really do enough. Same thing for the Ankros Prime. Considering, what you have to do to get this weapon, there's just not really anything there that these weapons can give you by the time you're going to have them, so MR fodder, unfortunately. Moving on to the Atarax, which is very much not MR fodder. This weapon is tailor-made to be absurdly powerful in the current meta of Warframe, where we've got the Shadow Det mods, where combo is super important, where slash damage is great, where status is starting to take hold, where criticals are all, just everything, and where spin attacks and large ranges are hugely just great to use because the power of melee weapons is so generally high. This weapon has absolutely everything going for it for the mods we currently have available in the game. Just wiping out entire rooms, level 300 enemies, doesn't matter, they in seconds just evaporate them. This weapon absolutely annihilates, unequivocally, to anything else in the game, really. This weapon destroys. The amount of damage this weapon can put out at such an intense range is absurd. It is absolutely incredible, and I couldn't really praise it enough considering how much work this weapon can get done just by itself. On a completely different note, the bow is a very good early game weapon. This weapon can be built into the Typedo, which makes it a good early game choice, and just in general, it's got decent status, you can stun lock enemies with it, so super early on, if you pick up a bow, planning to build it into the Typedo, which is also a good weapon, it's a good early game choice. It's very nice. Mark 1 bow, into Typedo, into Legion. It's a really good trend to follow. Similarly, the Bow Prime, if you happen to run into it, is a fine weapon. It's okay. It's got things going for it. The bow stances are pretty good. The status is pretty alright. It's got enough critical chance, and it's pretty fast. The range on this weapon is also not small, so it's just fine. I'd like it to maybe be a little bit stronger since it is a Prime weapon, but pretty good overall. The Bolt Ace, another weapon which I would best describe as fine. These are kind of high requirement to build, but they do enough work for what they cost. And they have just generally pretty high damage, good spin attack, just generally pretty good at killing enemies at around the time when you'd be able to acquire these. The Broken Scepter. So this is the War Within reward. This is interesting. It has a unique gimmick where you can pull health and energy out of defeated enemies, but it's slow and the 30% status doesn't really make up for that, and it's just not great. Its base damage isn't high enough, its attack speed is fine, but its critical chance is only 10%, and the status isn't really doing it because this is a mostly impact-based weapon, so unfortunately, unless maybe there's a full version of this that we can build later, kind of useless. But I would advise people to keep it in case there is a use in the future, because this is, of course, the War Within reward, and you won't be able to get it back. A quest reward, however, that is very, very useful. Broken War. This is the best in class for single swords. This weapon is absolutely fantastic. Used with Crimson Dervish, it can annihilate things very, very quickly. And even though at base value, its 15% crit chance and 10% status don't seem like a lot, and it has a low critical multiplier, using this with Crimson Dervish gives it a 3x damage multiplier, which is enormously useful, opening enemies up to finishers and just generally finishing them off very, very quickly. It actually makes this weapon significantly better than all other single swords. Alright, moving on to the cost assist. So this weapon is fine. It's not really fine for when you're able to actually acquire this weapon, though, because it's just not that strong in the grand scheme of things. It's fine. Its gimmick is okay. It's much less okay since it's nerfed. The 30% status chance is good, and it's got corrosive innately, so that's fine, but 5% critical chance really isn't helping this weapon out, and it just isn't strong enough for what you want. Also, besides that, its range is quite short whenever you're not considering its charge-up attack, so it's just not really worth using by the time you can actually acquire this weapon. Alright, here we have our first dagger. So, any dagger that does not have a unique utility or other niche use, I'm going to label Master Rank fodder, because they all just have covert lethality, so they're all pretty much equal besides their small utility perks. Unfortunately, that's kind of just what daggers are right now, and we have a lot of them. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. Covert lethality is very good, but this ramp dagger doesn't really have anything unique going for it. Moving on to the Serrata, our first glaive. So glaives are very nichely useful in certain MR tests, but unfortunately, they don't really have any other use. Since the Trinity changes way back when, these weapons have kind of completely gone out of the realm of usefulness and don't really have a current place in the game, so pretty much all of them are, unfortunately, going to be mastery fodder. The Cronus, this is like the definition of mastery fodder. It's like a slightly better Skana, pretty much worthless. In a similar vein, the Docker Prime is worse than the Broken War and is about 20 times harder to get. Unfortunate MR fodder, because it does look real nice. Dark Dagger, once again, the things I said before kind of apply here. It's a dagger, use covert lethality. The upside to this, though, is that there is a Rakta augment for it, which means this weapon can give you energy back if you're using the augment. So, slight plus there, but basically MR fodder because there are other daggers that outclass this. The Dark Split Sword. So here's where we're going to get into a little bit of a special case. So there are a lot of dual swords, and there are a lot of really good dual swords, and this is one of, if not the best, dual sword set. With that, there are a lot of those one of, if not the best, and I'm going to treat them as such because they are so close that I would actually put it down to preference which one is actually the best. But while we're talking about the Dark Split Sword, this weapon is completely worthless in heavy weapon mode and should only be used in its split sword mode. It is really quite devastating in that split sword mode, but under no circumstances should you leave this in its heavy weapon variant, because it is an absolutely terrible heavy weapon. Dark Sword, we've already been over the best in class sword, the Broken War. The Dark Sword is not good. It's just MR fodder, unfortunately. Much too hard to get for what it can offer. The Destreza, so this is another one of those weapons that is just fine. There's nothing crazy about this weapon. It's not bad. It's not ridiculous. It's got a good stance, but not an amazing stance. It doesn't have momentum, so there's that where you need to plan around doing stuff with that. Its status chance isn't great, but it has a good critical chance. It's very middle of the road. This is mostly a style choice, but it's worth noting that if and when we get Destreza Prime, it will probably be absolutely outstanding, so I'm very much looking forward to that. Dextacra. So these are an anniversary weapon. They're okay. They're not really any like big standout or anything like that. They're just fine. They've got decent status, okay crit. They're kind of slow, and they're just okay. They're slash based, so I guess that's nice, but basically just MR fodder. For anyone that's wondering, we're going to be getting another set of these in March. So anyone that did not get the anniversary weapons before, you can look forward to that then. All right, moving on to the Dragon Ikana. So this weapon is fine. Unfortunately, its MR is not exactly fine for where it sits right now, because by the time you get to the MR that this weapon wants, if we were looking to get an Ikana, you could have pretty easily gotten an Ikana Prime. So, as it stands right now, this weapon doesn't really have a place because anyone who's looking to get an Ikana will have an Ikana Prime by the time they would want to get this weapon. So, while this weapon is okay, it's outclassed by the Ikana Prime by a great deal, so it's not going to see any real use as long as you don't just happen upon getting this, which, with the way you build this weapon, isn't very likely. Dual cleavers, these are MR fodder. They do have an augment, but we'll talk about that when we get to the actually good dual cleavers. So, MR fodder, unfortunately. Dual ether, MR fodder. You're going to notice a trend with all the ether weapons and that they're just not very good. Alright, dual heat swords. So, these weapons are okay, super early, but that's about it. They are fine and they're fun, but that's really all I can say. They're mostly going to be MR fodder. Dual Ichor, on the other hand, are outstanding. These are another one of those, like, very good, if not best in class dual swords we've been talking about. They are elemental. They've got incredibly good critical multiplier, very good critical chance, 15% status is not terrible, and they've got good attack speed. These weapons are very good. They are in competition with all of the other very good dual swords that we are coming up on talking about. Dual Kamas, on the other hand, these are mastery fodder. They are not very good at all, and they are a real pain in the ass to build also. Their Prime variant, on the other hand, is very good. This is, as with the dual Ichors, these are very good weapons that are in competition with being the best dual swords. So these are very strong. 20% status is really good. They have pretty high base damage for dual swords. 15% critical chance is totally fine, and they're fast. They have many things going for them. These weapons are really strong and kind of just an offset to the other very good dual swords. The dual Raza, on the other hand, while these weapons are quite good, are unfortunately a bit slow, and they only have 5% status chance, so even with their 3x crit multiplier, they're unfortunately falling just behind the other incredible dual swords. So while these weapons are good, and they're absolutely usable, they are outclassed by a number of their competitors in their weapon class. Dual Skana, on the other hand, these are MR fodder. I don't think I really need to explain why a Skana variant is MR fodder, so let's just leave it at that. Dual Zoran. So early on, these are actually fine. They have 25% critical chance, 3x crit multiplier. Status is low, but you don't really need that early on. They're slash focused. If you get these early, they're actually perfectly fine. Maybe you ran into... Actually, you will get a stance for these from one of the early junctions, so that's really good. If you pick them up super early, it's a good thing to have. They're a little short, but that's about it. Ether daggers. So these are our first twin daggers. All twin daggers are absolutely useless and are terrible. They're all MR fodder, so from now on, we're mostly just going to skip them. Ether Reaper. So compared to pretty much all the other Reapers, this weapon doesn't really rate at all, even compared to the Anku, so let's just move on. Ether Sword, another MR fodder. All the Ether weapons kind of following a trend here. Bang, these are twin daggers, MR fodder. Bang Prime, twin daggers again, MR fodder. Look at that, weird. The regular Fragor. So the regular Fragor, if you get it early, much like a couple of the other weapons we've talked about, is quite good. And you will get it early because this is a junction reward. So if you like slower weapons, but weapons that hit kind of like a fucking huge truck, this is a pretty good thing to get early on. There's no real reason not to build it because it's incredibly cheap, so you might as well try it out when you get it early on. And it's honestly quite good for a while. If you get a stance for this early, this could carry you like quite a ways into the mid game. Fragor Prime. So, Fragor Prime is by far best in class for hammers in terms of just raw damage that you can output. This weapon hits impossibly hard. 35% crit chance with a 2.5 crit multiplier. 10% status, not even necessary. A bonus. This weapon destroys. Even though it's impact focused, this weapon does so much damage, it doesn't even really matter what kind of damage it's doing. You are going to, whatever you hit is either going to space or it's going 6 feet under. Those are the only real two options that you have whenever you're hitting something with the Fragor Prime, because this weapon absolutely demolishes in terms of damage output. A very, very solid weapon, and it's beautiful. Regular Furex, so these don't really have a ton going for them, just MR fodder. Furex Wraith, so if you somehow get your hands on these early on, these are going to be really good, but unfortunately they're outclassed by a large variety of weapons later on, so the likelihood of you actually getting any real use out of these is pretty low. Even with 25% crit chance and a 2.5 crit multiplier, these weapons are outclassed by other fist weapons even, so unfortunately, they kind of take a back seat. If these were readily available though, they'd be a very, very good option in general. So if you get them early, absolutely use them. Moving on, we've got the Galatine. So much like the Fragor, if and when you get this early on, this weapon kind of mops shit up real easy like. It does a lot of upfront damage. It's got decent attack speed considering it's a heavy weapon. 10% critical chance considering when you can acquire this weapon is totally fine. And 20% status might actually be a little high for whenever you can acquire this weapon. All things considered, this weapon can carry you very easily from the early all the way to the late game if you just invest in it, especially if you get an early Cleaving Whirlwind drop or trade for that mod. It is very, very powerful and can carry you all the way until you get its Prime variant. So, the Galatine Prime is my number 2. This weapon is incredibly powerful. It has so much upfront base damage, and it just crushes. 20% crit chance, 20% status, a good 2 multiplier, and its spread of IPS, which is very, very weighted on slash, means this weapon can use an Atarax-like build and do tons of slash through armor. You can just use an upfront, just status build and just crush things. Tons of viral, tons of whatever element you want. It will annihilate under pretty much any circumstance. That, combined with having access to Temporeal, one of the most mobile and best stances in the game, and Cleaving Whirlwind, pretty much the highest damage stance in the game, gives this weapon a lot of variety in what you can accomplish with it, and it's good for pretty much any Warframe. This weapon absolutely demolishes under pretty much any circumstance you'd like to put it under. The Ghazal Machete. So, unfortunately, this thing's gimmick doesn't really come through, and even if you're using it in the ideal scenario, there are much better weapons you could be using. So, like all the other machetes, this weapon is MR fodder. Moving on, we've got the proper glaive. So, if you get this from login rewards early on, this weapon's okay. It's good for those MR challenges, like the Serrata would be, and it's just fine in general. There's nothing too special here. If you like throwing weapons, it's good for that, I suppose. But if you don't get it early, gonna be MR fodder. Unfortunately, that remains true of its Prime variant as well. Unfortunately, this weapon didn't get the buffs it was slated to get, which I think would have made this weapon actually quite good. So, as it stands right now, unfortunately, it's MR fodder. The Graham, you should instead get any of the other early heavy weapons. This is very much MR fodder. The Helicar, once again, it might not look it, but it's a glaive. In the same boat with all the other glaives being MR fodder, its gimmick just isn't strong enough to put it anywhere else. Hate. So, Hate is actually best in class for the sides. Unfortunately, on the whole, sides just aren't that strong, but that doesn't mean this weapon is useless. If you want to put some form into it and give it a little bit of love, you can pretty easily use this in endgame type levels, but I probably wouldn't suggest that in general. If, however, you get this from one of your earlier Stalker encounters, it's a very good melee weapon through the entirety of, like, the early all the way to the late game if you really want it to be, so it's got that going for it. Combine that with early on all of the sight stances being very, very easy to come by just in general, and it's pretty good. If you get it early, absolutely use it. Absolutely use this weapon. Heat Dagger, MR fodder. It can use covert lethality though, so I guess there's that. Heat Sword. So we have some very hot MR fodder. Yep, that's what this is. The regular Heliacore. So, surprisingly, this weapon is actually quite strong. You can output a very good amount of damage with this weapon, and considering its gimmick, if you'd like to fill your codex, this is actually a very good way to do so. Its gimmick works for it, it does good damage, and for some absurdist reason, this weapon outclasses its variant, which is unique, to say the least, and kind of unfortunate. Haruto. So this weapon is best in class for the sparring weapons, and the sparring weapons are not really very competitive section of weapon, but this weapon might be trying to make it that way. This weapon is, it's so hard to die using this weapon. In anything that is below level 70, if you're hitting things, you're just healing to full pretty much every strike you throw. It's a really, really strong gimmick on a weapon that actually has pretty good upfront damage, so by all means, this weapon is quite good. It has a gimmick that very much works, and it has damage to back that up. The Jatka tag. So this is very good, but it's a different kind of very good than you would get from the Fragor Prime, in that this weapon is not as just severely and impossibly damaging as we would get from the Fragor Prime. It's more of an area clear thing. The range on this weapon is significantly higher than the Fragor Prime, and along with that, it has a very good augment. So this is kind of a completely different purpose than the Fragor Prime, and I would say that in general, it's actually kind of equally as good, and I just personally prefer the Fragor Prime myself. Jaw Sword, very much MR fodder, totally useless. 1 comma, yep, totally useless, worthless thing. The Cursed, MR fodder, although it is pretty. The Kesh Egg, so if you have Maiming Strike, which I know seems ridiculous, this weapon is mediocre. So, if that doesn't tell you this is MR fodder, nothing will. The Kestrel, it's a boomerang, but it's considered a glaive for all intents and purposes. It's MR fodder, unfortunately. Although, very, very nichely useful because it is a knockdown. The Gogake, so these are MR fodder, although they are a very good bit of fun early on if you'd like to consider them for that. One of my old favorites from back in the day, let's call it. The Cronin, so these weapons are fine. They're the mid-step between the Bolt Ace, so I mean, build them for that, really. These weapons are totally fine on their own, though, and they do decently well. The Bolt Ace are just very slightly better. The Lacera, so unfortunately this weapon is pretty much completely outclassed by the only other blade whip in the game, but this weapon's okay. It's got very, very high status, and I guess it has that going for it. But unfortunately, the Mios exists, so when we get there, we'll talk about that. Electa, unfortunate MR fodder, although it does have a variant we'll be talking about. The Legion, so surprise, surprise, this is my number 4. This weapon is incredibly powerful. This is one of the weapons that I very much misjudged whenever it first came out. This weapon does absurd amounts of damage. This is the poster boy, I'd call it, for just using the stealth gas damage, and it is absolutely devastating. It has very high damage. The passive you can get from this weapon with the increased attack speed and the toxin going into even more gas damage, and with that, it being weighted towards slash, so whenever you're doing your statuses, you're getting slash and gas. All of that is stealth. It's very, very strong, and this is the natural evolution of a line of very good weapons, which is the bow into the Taipido into the Legion. So if you want to just start out and have something that you're just going to build up into being one of the best weapons in the game over time, it's a very, very good direction to go in. The Machete, as we discussed before, all machetes are terrible. MR fodder. Yep, even the Wraith versions. MR fodder. The Magistar, so this weapon's just really not worth it at all. MR fodder. So, now we are to the Mios. This is the best in class for the Blade and Whip, which, admittedly, not a large class, but the Mios is comparable to the Legion. You can use it in a very similar way, and unfortunately, it's a little inconsistent with its strike distances, and it's hard to get used to. But overall, the Mios is a very, very strong weapon that has good status, good crit, good range, good attack speed, a nice damage spread at base, even if it is a little too even for my taste. Could be a little more slash focused. But overall, very good. And even beyond that, it's got the nice whip, blade and whip benefit of being able to pull enemies, which is a niche use. The Meyer, MR fodder. Mark 1 bow. So this is the weapon that I would suggest most people start out with. It can stun lock enemies, and that stuff's good. Other than that, it's a basic starting weapon. Not much to be said here. Mark 1 Furax. These are, they're very much MR fodder. Very much. The Nami Skilla, MR fodder. There are way better dual swords. Way better. Way better. The Nami Solo. Once again, there's way better. Way better. Alright, the regular Nakana. So, this weapon is fine. There's nothing, like, particularly crazy about it. It's a nice slash-focused weapon. It's got okay critical chance, okay status. If you like katanas, it's a weapon I might suggest you pick up. It builds into the Dragon Nakana, which, I mean, at MR8, that's a little cheap amount, a bit more mastery. But, I mean, generally, if you want a katana-type weapon, you're going to want to get a Nakana Prime. Speaking of which, the Nakana Prime. This weapon is very, very good. 20% critical chance, 20% status chance. Where have we seen those values before? Oh, right, the Galatine Prime. Very good values. It's slash-focused. Where have we seen that before? Weird, the Galatine Prime. This is basically a small Galatine Prime, which is absolutely fine because the Nakana stances are very, very good. So, this is a weapon that you can use pretty much anywhere. The one downside I'd say compared to a lot of other weapons that work similarly to the Nakana Prime is that the range is a bit short on the Nakanas. But outside of that, fantastic weapon. The Ninkandi. So, unfortunately, these weapons don't get a best in class because none of the nunchucks are worth using. They're all MR fodder. The Obex, unfortunately MR fodder, but they do have a cool slam attack. I'll give them that. Alright, the Oma. So, I don't feel a huge need to go too far into this, but suffice it to say, these have the highest slide attack damage in the game, and they hit like a goddamn truck, which we all saw yesterday in the Why Would You Use for these things. Gas build viable, tons of damage, big downside, low range. The low range is really the only downside this weapon actually has, but it's pretty significant given the current state of weapons that have a lot of range that are very powerful. The Okina, these are twin daggers. They're awful MR fodder. Regular Orthos. So, this weapon is okay early on, or it would be. This is MR fodder because the Orthos Prime is so readily available to new players. This weapon is like the lowest bar Prime, almost period. It is so easy to acquire the Orthos Prime. It costs next to nothing, and it's very good, just in general. Like, for what you have to do to get this weapon, which is near nothing in most cases, it's very good. It's incredibly large, it's got good critical chance, it's got good status, it's okay, and it's very slash-focused. All this stuff puts up to it having just a lot of advantages. It's a good weapon. Alright, and then we have the Orvia. So this is another glaive and is, unfortunately, MR fodder. Though, it is worth noting, the gimmick for this weapon sort of works, and if you really want to make it work, it can, it's just not worth it. The Pangolin Sword, very much MR fodder, this thing's awful. The Plasma Sword, probably the worst melee weapon in the entire game. It is unthinkably slow. The Prisma Dual Cleavers, so this is another one of those dual swords where it is one of, if not the best, dual swords. Given that, it has a very good augment, it's got a really good critical chance, it's got a 3x crit multiplier, it's got 25% status, it's real strong, it's slash focused as well. It's hard to say bad things about this, but it's hard to say bad things about a lot of the dual swords. If you like these weapons, absolutely use them, they're incredible. One of my favorites. Alright, and then we have the Prismaskana. So, surprise, surprise, this dual sword is not mastery fodder. It has a good critical chance, good crit multiplier, decent status, a good IPS spread, and along with that, it's got a good augment. So, with that, it puts this weapon in a unique position where it's actually kind of a side grade to the Broken War, if you'd like the augment effect, which is quite good. So, it's very usable. Pick it up from Borrow when you get the chance. Prova. Provas are machete-type weapons. They're awful. Yep, even the Vandal version. Alright, moving on, we've got the best-in-class Dagger. So, this can use Covert Lethality. Whenever you proc radiation on enemies and then do damage, you get overshields, and even on top of that, it can use the Augment for Dark Daggers, which makes it so that it can restore energy to you. So, this has generally the most upsides of any of the daggers, which makes it the best by proxy of that. And we've got the Reaper Prime. So, unfortunately, this weapon is, it's okay. It's okay. It, like, for what you have to do to get this weapon, not worth it at all. It is pretty. So, basically MR fodder. Moving on, we've got our first Gunblade. So, the Redeemer is the best in class of the Gunblades, given that there are only two. But, these weapons, both, this and the Sarpa, are very good. The Redeemer in particular, though, has incredibly high burst damage, as in it is just incredibly good in a variety of scenarios. Specifically, killing any of the assassins, specifically Stalker, in one shot, and the Sentients, just blowing them away in one shot. The burst damage is very real with the Redeemer, and it's just very good overall. The Ripka, so while not best in class, these weapons are fine. They're okay. They got 15% status, 20% crit, regular multiplier, slash focus. The bad thing that I can say about, I guess, just all claws applies here, which is it's very short range. The Sancti Magistar. Oh, how I wish this weapon was better. So, given what you have to do in order to qualify to use this weapon's not very good at all. Its gimmick is not useful. The healing pulse is very mediocre. Its impact focus, which is not great. And while 20% crit chance is fine and 10% status chance is fine, for a weapon of this MR, it's just not worth it, period. Moving on, we have the only other Gunblade. So the Sarp is fine. I think it's only slightly worse than the Redeemer, and it's kind of interesting to use, so try it. I think it might just be my personal preference in general that I like the Redeemer more, so if you're looking at the Gunblades, probably build them both and decide for yourself which one you like more, because they're actually both quite good. The Sindo. So, this weapon is very good early on. This along with Galatine, this along with the regular Fragor. Good builds early on, does good damage, nothing really to complain about as an early game weapon. Then we have the Sindo Prime. So, this weapon is very strong. Unfortunately, it is purely worse than the Galatine Prime, which seems ridiculous, I know, because the Galatine Prime is considered by me the second best weapon in the game. So, a slightly weaker version of that is very, very good. Basically, if you're not MR13, which the Galatine Prime requires, this is your runner-up. It's incredibly powerful. It's just been outclassed by the Galatine Prime. Simple as that. The Skoliac. So, unfortunately, this weapon's just not very good. 15% status, 5% crit, a low crit multiplier. Nothing can really save this weapon. So, unfortunately, MR fodder. The Secure Electa. So, the nerf to this weapon just happened. So, my thoughts on this weapon are not entirely based on, let's call it long-term testing, but early impressions based on what has gone on with the nerf of this weapon are that this weapon still has good damage. It's still fine in general. You can still use it very Atarax-like build and get good results with this weapon. Using a gas-type build is still effective, and you get more credits when you use it. So, if you're someone who wants to farm out some credits, no real reason not to bring this thing, because it's okay. Fine, want more credits? Use it. The Sero. Unfortunately, there are much better polearms. MR fodder. Chaku, as stated before, all of the nunchucks are MR fodder. The Sheev. MR fodder. Another dagger. Then we have the Cibair. So the Cibair is in a bit of a unique position in that this weapon just costs too damn much. It's very much like the Jack-a-Tag, except for this weapon costs a goddamn arm and a leg. It is absurdly expensive. Like, it is so much cryotic for the amount of not great that you get out of it. It is absolutely not worth farming for by any means, because you should just get a Jack-a-Tag instead. However, if you just happen to have done a shit ton of excavation like I had, throw the resources at it. Fuck it, why not? Sylvan Aegis. So, these are the other sword and shield. They're abysmal. Even after their buff, these things are worthless. Not worth using, even in the slightest. Regular Skana, one of the starting weapons. I think it's the lesser of the two starting melee weapons. So, it's still fine, though. Skana Prime, hey, it's shiny. It's shiny, there's that. It looks nice, huh? The Sidon, MR fodder, once again. The Sinoid Heliacore. So, somehow this weapon is worse than its regular variant, which is not normal. It has much worse critical chance, and a worse multiplier, but better status. It still has the scanning enemies gimmick, but then it has a worthless channeling gimmick attached to it that really doesn't do anything. So, just use the regular version, please. The Tekko. So, these are the best in class for the fist weapons. They attack very quickly, they have very good crit chance, they have decent status for how fast they attack, they're very slash focused, and that's all she wrote. They are very good, very high damage, Gaia's Tragedy, fuck shit up with them. They're also incredibly fun. Alright, the Telos Boltes. So, these things come in at number 3. They are basically a weaker Atarax, but they have a larger range, which is nice. And just in general, they're in a very unique position where their vertical attack capabilities are much more extensive than a lot of other melee weapons, and in fitting with that, these are the best box opener in the game, which might seem not that important, but considering there's a lot of times when you just need to open boxes in Warframe to get Iatan stars, to find certain things, lots of scavenger hunt stuff, and couple that with these being very, very able to clear everything in the star chart, they're incredibly good weapons, and there's not much I can say that's bad about them. They're just a weaker Atarax that also has a lot of utility bonuses, so they're really good. The Type-O. So, as I stated before, this is a really good weapon. Built out of the bow, goes into the Legion, which is one of the best melee weapons in the game. Hard to not recommend this weapon. It's very, very strong. Very, very good mid-game, easily usable in the late game. It's very good. There's no real two ways about it. 20% status, 20% crit, good stat line. There's nothing I can say terrible about this weapon. The Tanbo is actually much in a similar way. Unfortunately, the Tanbo doesn't build into any like crazy weapon, but for a mid-game thing, this is not critical focused, but for status, you can apply some good status here and do some good damage with a Tanbo. So that early, mid, late, very good area to have a Tanbo in. The Twin Basalt. So these weapons actually used to be completely terrible, but since they're buffs, they're surprisingly good actually. They are all elemental, which gives you the opportunity to proc a ton of an elemental if you'd like to. So with 40% status, if you'd like to go with a gas focused build for these, they're actually quite strong. If you go gas stealth, such as like with Loki or other invisibility frames, you can kick out a lot of damage with the Twin Basalt, and they're totally usable. Couple that with them actually having a pretty interesting and fun augment, and I actually would kind of recommend you build these, which surprises even me. The Vacor Sidon. So this weapon has good stats overall. 15% crit is fine, 25% status is fine, its stat line just in general, it's fine, its attack speed's not bad, and it has a gimmick that works. It's one of the better weapons in the game, I'd say, mostly because when you're using the gimmick in kind of the unintended way, probably, with the taunt mod and then just blinding areas a lot, you have a blind on command, essentially, and that's useful, so it's fine. Pretty niche, but interesting. Regular Venka, MR fodder, unfortunately. Venka Prime, however, is best in class. So these have a unique gimmick where they do a higher crit multiplier than normal, which means these weapons can kick out an absolute shit ton of focus damage on basically single targets. Their range is where this weapon unfortunately kind of falls apart. So while you can do intense single target damage with a very good 2.5 crit multiplier, 25% crit chance, 15% status, very slash focused, you can really tear a couple of guys right in front of you all to hell. But the range is what really kills these in general, even though they are the best in class for the claws. Alright, moving on near last, we've got War. So, not terribly long ago, I would have told you that War is probably the best heavy weapon. That has since changed because Galatine Prime exists now. So, Galatine Prime and this are incredibly similar. Galatine Prime just has more damage and is slash focused, which is just purely better. So, War is just outclassed and incredibly difficult to build, so And finally, we've got the Zenistar. So the Zenistar is my 5th top melee weapon. Although, this weapon is not exactly used for melee. The special gimmick of this weapon, which is throwing out the disc, is absurdly, borderline broken overpowered. It is so incredibly good, and you can use it in combination with so many like just ridiculous things, like Ivara using her 2 on it, just blinds stacking with gas damage from this thing, just general CC. It is absolutely incredible, which puts it at number 5. It is so powerful. It's hard to find bad things to say about this weapon just with the way that you use it, because regularly you'd look at this and say the crit damage is probably too low, but with the way you use this weapon, the crit damage really kind of doesn't matter. So with that wraps up the melee weapon review video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you guys think, if I got any weapons wrong or anything like that. And I'll see you tomorrow.